What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Steve.
I'm Lindsay.
Today we are finally going to be reacting to Margaret Thatcher and learning about who she was. I don't know about you, but I don't really know anything about Margaret Thatcher except that she was a British politician and obviously a prime minister at some point.
I mean, I didn't even know that until you told me. Oh, right. So, no. I just knew she had something to do with British politics. That's all I knew.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was kind of... I don't know exactly when she was in power, but I'm guessing it was kind of more towards when I was a kid or something. I don't really know for sure.
Yeah, I didn't realize she was a prime minister for sure. So,
but all I know is that she was both very loved and very hated.
One of the very divisive, like...
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know anything about her politics, you know. So that's what we're going to be learning today. Trying to figure out who Margaret Thatcher was, not taking a side here. So if you love her or you hate her, we're just coming into this to learn about who Margaret Thatcher was. So I think we'll just go ahead and dive in and check this out.
She's one of the longest serving prime ministers in British history. As head of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher led the UK from May 1979 right the way through to November of 1990. In that time, she ushered in an era of reform unparalleled in the 20th century. Under her watch, the post-war settlement was torn up, state assets were privatised, the financial market let rip, and the cultural fabric of Britain changed beyond recognition. But the transformations didn't just stop at home. Alongside her US counterpart Ronald Reagan, Thatcher helped spread the gospel of economic liberty and individual freedom across the entire planet. When she finally left office, she was widely recognised as the most significant British leader since Churchill.
Wow. The most significant British leader since Churchill.
Yes, while Churchill is still widely loved in the UK, Margaret Thatcher's legacy is hugely divisive. Taking over and ailing Britain, her economic shock therapy devastated entire regions, even as it saved the country as a whole. Both worshipped and reviled at home. This is the story of Britain's most controversial leader. Right up until Thatcher became Education Secretary in 1969, there had only ever been 4 female cabinet ministers in UK history and not a single prime minister. As Thatcher herself would say in a TV interview in 1973, the idea of a woman ever rising beyond the cabinet to become prime minister seemed impossible.
So I know that
her first prime minister that was female.
Yes, and I know there was one. I can't remember. Was it Liz something? Yeah, she was a very short prime minister. Like, what did she last? Like a month or a couple months? Like recently.
Theresa May.
Oh, Theresa May. Yeah, Theresa May.
She was a prime minister.
Liz Truss, Margaret Thatcher. Are those the only 3 female prime ministers, or have there been others?
In 1945, the UK's first post-war election resulted in a shock win, not for Winston Churchill's Conservatives, but for the left-wing Labour Party of Clement Attlee. The Labour landslide completely upended Britain. In his 6 years in power, Attlee created the NHS, the welfare state, and what became known as the post-war settlements, an unspoken agreement between the parties that the state needed to interfere in the economy. Naturally, Thatcher hated this. 1 year after Attlee took power, she became president of the Oxford University Conservative Association, from where she railed against the Labour tide transforming Britain. So good was she at this that it soon convinced her to enter politics proper. At the 1950 election, Thatcher stood as a Conservative candidate for the seat of Dartford.
Wow! You realize that was literally almost 30 years before she became the leader of Britain.
Wow.
I think in 1950, she was already getting involved in politics. It makes me wonder how old she was when she was prime minister. So she would have been in her 50s when she became prime minister. Okay, so that's... Okay, so she just got her start in politics at a young age.
Did I hear him correctly when he said she didn't like the NHS being formed? Is that what it was?
I don't know if it was that. I think she didn't like the idea of the state being involved in the economy. I think that's what he was talking about.
In 1959, after a few years practicing as a barrister, Thatcher stood again for election, this time in the Conservative safe seat of Finchley. Unsurprisingly, she won. More surprisingly, she soon began to skyrocket up through the party's ranks.
And so a barrister is basically kind of like a lawyer, right?
Yeah, like the court.
Yeah.
Something to do with the courts.
Yeah, so she was, okay, so she was basically a lawyer, I guess, to begin with, which a lot of politicians do get their start in law, so.
Yeah.
By 1961, she'd been appointed secretary in the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance. Although her party lost power in 1964, its new leader, Ted Heath, invited her into the shadow cabinet. Sadly, not the Tory version of the Council of Doom, but what us Brits call the out-of-power party's highest-ranking members. That meant that when Heath unexpectedly won the 1970 election, Margaret Thatcher became only the 5th female cabinet minister in British history. But for Margaret Thatcher, it was also the decade when everyone associated her primarily with milk. In 1971, looking to make savings in the education budget, Thatcher eliminated a post-war policy of free school milk for children.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. Okay, that I can imagine.
Oh, that's kind of sad.
Would have been a huge deal at the time.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of kids, they probably didn't get much nutrition at home during that time period.
The low-income kids.
Right, yeah. And so...
Yeah,
I could see that
milk would have been a huge deal at school. Wow.
Although it was justifiable, the optics were so bad that it became a PR disaster. For the rest of her tenure, Thatcher was followed everywhere by cries of "Thatcher, milk snatcher."
Oh my gosh.
Unpleasant as...
I gotta say, that's catchy.
That is very catchy.
That sticks.
Yeah, Thatcher, the milk snatcher.
Oh, that's sad.
I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I don't think she did that to make,
no, I'm sure she wasn't trying to be evil.
No, it was literally just it made sense financially at the time for the country.
Yeah,
I bet there was some struggles.
It just seems like there might have been a better thing to eliminate.
It was nothing compared to what was going on behind the scenes. Thatcher and Ted Heath hated one another. While it was partly personal, it was also Thatcher being sick of defending her government's dreadful record. It was under Heath that the 3-day week came in, when businesses were only allowed electricity 3 days a week to conserve energy. As a result, the Conservatives lost both 1974 elections.
That was in the 70s?
Thatcher was out of government, but...
Why?
Okay, I would have, if someone told me that and asked me when that probably took place, I would be like, probably during World War II or something. The 70s,
Wait, so the milk thing happened during the 70s too?
I think it was the early 70s, what it sounded like.
Oh.
Maybe, yeah, it had to be.
See, I thought that was during like the war too.
No, maybe there's just some really big struggles financially in Britain.
Yeah, what was going on in the 70s in Britain that you guys had to cut back so much? Like, what was...
Now, I know if you look in the US, like it was around the late 70s, early 80s, there were definitely some struggles going on financially here. You would see if you look at old pictures, you'll see the lines where people are waiting for gas for like a mile or something. So I think there was something going on globally at the time, but I don't really know exactly what it was. So.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Now the grocer's daughter from Lincolnshire knew what she had to do. She had to get rid of Heath. The newspapers thought she was out of her mind. When Thatcher stood for leader of the Tories, it was assumed that Heath would romp home to victory. But Thatcher went on the attack. Gathering the party's right wing around her, she lambasted Heath's dreadful record. In February 1975, the shock results of the first ballot came in. Thatcher had won. Now, under the Conservative Party's weird rules, this didn't actually make her the leader, but Heath could see his position was untenable, and he stepped aside. And just like that, Thatcher became the first female leader of a major UK party.
Wow.
Not that anyone expected her to rise any further. James Callaghan, a guy so inept that he turned a mildly pro-Labour country into rabid Tories. Under Callaghan, Britain collapsed into economic turmoil. There were gigantic pay freezes, nationwide battles with overpowered unions. In late 1978, things culminated in the Winter of Discontent, a period when uncollected refuse piled high in the streets and bodies were left unburied. It was likely the country's...
That blows my mind.
Wow.
In the late 70s?
Yeah.
Into the 80s.
Bodies not being buried and trash everywhere. What was going on? I get obviously there were some economic struggles going on, but what was actually going on behind the scenes to cause things like this happening?
That's shocking to me.
Yeah, it really is to me too.
War low point. The UK was an ungovernable mess. It was also exactly what Thatcher needed. On March the 28th, Margaret Thatcher called a no-confidence vote in Callaghan's government, triggering an early election. As the campaign heated up, the Conservatives played a blinder, plastering London with posters of long dole queues under the caption, "Labour isn't working." Callaghan, meanwhile, gave the impression of someone who expected to win because, well, duh, his opponent was a girl. On May the 3rd, 1979, the Conservatives won the election by a decent margin. It wasn't a landslide, but it was definitely enough to comfortably form a government. On that date, Margaret Thatcher became not only the UK's first female Prime Minister, but the first female leader of any major Western democracy.
Wow.
Wow.
The first female leader of any Western democracy?
I had no idea.
That's iconic.
As she entered 10 Downing Street, the triumphant Thatcher declared,
"Where there is discord, may we bring harmony."
As you're about to see, this wouldn't exactly happen. As 1982 dawned, it looked like Britain's first female PM was doomed to be a one-term wonder. In her first years in power, Thatcher had set out her governing style: antagonistic, determined, destructive. In a weird way, she was like a 2010s tech mogul, someone who disrupted, who broke stuff, who assembled something from the wreckage of the old. During her later terms, the economic gains from this destruction would be enough to keep Middle England on side. But as her first term swept by, those gains had yet to materialise. All anyone could see was the destruction. More businesses were failing than...
Break Thatcher's back status now.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
I have no idea. What's that mean, guys? I don't really get it. And you see the Irish flag?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure what this sign is representing.
Me either.
At any time since the Great Depression, unemployment was at record-breaking highs. Privatization of state assets had so far cost tens of thousands of jobs, but not yet brought visible benefits. Despite a famous declaration in October of 1980 that the ladies not for turning, Thatcher's closest advisers were secretly urging her to make a gigantic U-turn lest the Tories be stomped at the 1983 election. And it was onto this sinking ship that Argentina suddenly threw a gigantic lifesaver. The Falklands War began. Today, it's almost impossible to overstate the effect the short war had on Thatcher's popularity. Remember how George W. Bush's approval rating hit 92% after 9/11? Well, something similar happened here. Make no mistake, the iron will Thatcher displayed in the face of foreign aggression made her a hero.
Is that why she called the Iron Lady?
Profile on the international stage. Already allied with US President Ronald Reagan, she now started to look like his equal. Come the 1983 election, Thatcher crushed Labour in a landslide. With her powerful new mandate, the gloves were at last off. Over the next 2 terms, Margaret Thatcher was going to change Britain beyond all recognition.
Wait, over the next 2 terms. So she had 3 terms?
It sounds like it.
I mean, I don't know how many terms can a prime minister have. Is it just unlimited?
On March 6, 1984, a local strike at Cortonwood Colliery was used by NUM President Arthur Scargill to force a general strike across the nation. But Thatcher was prepared. Coal had been secretly stockpiled. Non-unionized firms were hired to do strike breaking. Police forces were primed to fight. The battle was on. And it really was a battle, or rather a series of battles. The worst took place at Orgreave, when a mounted police charge into a crowd of strikers led to 123 serious injuries. But the main weapon Thatcher deployed wasn't truncheons, but time. As the strike dragged on, laws were passed that stopped the families of striking miners from receiving welfare. In effect, Thatcher starved her enemies into submission, and submit they did. On March 3, 1985, the strike was called off. The miners returned to work. Broken. The next decade, McGregor and his successors closed all but 15 of Britain's 174 deep pits. The economic engine of entire regions was wiped out, leaving jobless wastelands. With NUM defeated, the days of big unions bringing Britain to a standstill were over. Thatcherism preached hard work, personal responsibility, and economic liberalism. It promised a world in which anyone could become well off, provided they were happy to roll up their sleeves. While this may have seemed a joke to those in depressed former mining towns, it was true for enough people to keep her in power. One of the most popular policies was right to buy, which allowed those in council housing to save up and buy the place for themselves. But the biggest rewards fell to those who profited from the Big Bang.
So council housing, what we understand, is like
government funded
housing, or like low income housing is what we call it here.
But it sounds like she set up like kind of rent to own or something.
Yeah.
Which that's really cool in my opinion.
That is actually pretty cool. I don't know how many people that helped at the time, but on the surface, that definitely sounds like, okay, so low-income people are in these low-income housing.
And otherwise would never be able to
afford a home, and they could instead, I don't know how that worked, but on the surface, yeah, that sounds interesting.
As early as 1979, Thatcher had begun loosening regulations in London's financial sector, leading to a lot of people becoming very rich. But it was on October the 27th, 1986, that things really took off. That was the day the city was almost completely deregulated, allowing things like foreign firms to own UK brokers and abolishing the fixed commission on trades. Overnight, the Big Bang made 1,500 millionaires. It created iconic districts like London's Canary Wharf. Skyscrapers began to sprout up. Money poured in. It was the transformation of the financial sector from the bowler hat-wearing old boys club of yesteryear into the turbo-capitalist free-for-all of today. Yet Thatcher's revolution went...
So
that is crazy.
She is the turning point for all that?
Wow.
Wow.
That's pretty shocking that London definitely wouldn't be what it is today without her influence. Yeah.
Wow. That's
How
amazing.
many of those skyscrapers and buildings were because of her doing that?
Wow.
For better or worse, I don't...
I mean, seeing that and looking back on that transformation that wouldn't have been, that's pretty impressive. Good or bad, I have no idea how what would be different today if that hadn't taken place. But just on the surface, you know, whether you're happy about that or not, just the transformation is really impressive.
Yeah.
It's beyond the mere confines of Britain. Under her watch, the UK became a global player in a way it simply hadn't been since Churchill left office. Invited to the Soviet Union in 1987, Thatcher went on live TV and spent an hour talking about all the USSR's failings. For citizens in communist nations, that speech was like seeing someone articulate everything they'd been feeling for decades. Thatcher became an overnight celebrity in the Eastern Bloc. Even today, countries like the Czech Republic consider her a British hero on par with Churchill. But overall, then, there was enough popular stuff in the Thatcher programme to ensure that she cruised to an easy victory in 1987, becoming the UK's only 20th century leader to serve 3 terms. And still, she seemed destined to go on. There was even talk of her winning a possible 4th term.
Oh, you can't go more than 3.
The woman who had overhauled Britain had already sown the seeds of her own destruction. When the end finally came, it was going to be with a swiftness that shocked everybody. The poll tax is why Scotland is, to this day, passionately anti-Tory. A political move designed to deprive Labour councils of revenue, it abolished local tax rates, instead levying a flat tax on every adult. The upshot was that the rich saw their bills plummet, while the middle classes, the very backbone of the Thatcherite revolution, saw their costs go shooting up. In 1989...
So it was a flat tax, but it increased, middle to lower class had to pay more.
It increased their tax rate from what it was, sounds like, by a lot, and it lowered wealthier people's tax rate by a lot.
Yeah, I could see that being a negative.
But what is the negative for her, it sounds like, was that she was loved by those very middle income or lower income people. It
probably just felt like a slap in the face.
She was loved by the working class, basically, and now it felt like a slap in the face, like you said. But I've always heard of poll tax, and I still don't exactly know what that means.
You would think it would have something to do with voting.
That's what I thought. That's what I've always thought when I heard poll tax. It sounds like voting, but this sounds like it was actually just something else, something about income. Yeah, I don't know.
Thatcher piloted it in Scotland ahead of a rollout across England and Wales. It was a disaster. There were protests, mass acts of civil disobedience. By 1990, over 1 million had refused to pay. Ministers begged Thatcher not to push ahead with the hated tax. But like a latter-day George III, Thatcher insisted on it. On March 31st, 1990, central London was devastated by an anti-poll tax riot. That summer, discontent brewed across the nation. Sadly, by now, Maggie had become a caricature of herself. She was the Iron Lady not for turning, even when turning would have saved her political career.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe she was a little too prideful, and that was her downfall. Like, if she had been a little more willing to compromise or meet in the middle, or...
Because it did sound like for a majority of her 3 terms, she seemed to have been fairly loved by a lot of people.
Yeah, but I mean, other people didn't like her too.
No, obviously, it just depends. But she obviously won 3 times, so obviously enough people liked her for that. But it sounds like at the end she just
was pushing too much and taking on a little, and then ended up upsetting the people that supported her.
That would have supported her in the first place, yeah.
Things finally came to a head in October. Following a European summit on integration, Thatcher gave an angry speech in which she replied to the idea with a shouted,
No, no, no.
In response, the pro-Europe cabinet member Geoffrey Howe resigned. For such a measured man, his resignation speech was devastating, concluding that the party needed to question its loyalty to Thatcher. At another time, Thatcher could have shrugged it off, but in 1990, with poll tax riots burning across the country and a pro-European party fed up with their Euroscepticism, she was toast. On November the 15th, the Europhile conservative Michael Hestenstein did what Thatcher had herself done to Heath all those years ago. He challenged her to a leadership contest, and when the results came in, Thatcher was doomed. Although she got the most votes, it had been by a pitiable margin. As the two headed into the second round, Thatcher realised to her profound shock that she might lose. So she jumped before she was pushed. At 7:30 a.m. on November the 22nd, 1990, Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister.
So she saved face. She didn't want to be defeated.
Right. That she didn't want that to be the headline. So
yeah, so she wanted the headline to be that she resigned.
Yeah.
Wow.
At the moment she stepped down, she was the longest continuously serving Prime Minister since 1827. She was also one of the two most influential post-war PMs, setting an economic agenda that has pretty much lasted intact until today. Only Clement Attlee really comes close in terms of significance, and it was his long-lasting post-war settlement that Thatcher ripped up. By 2000, she was showing signs of the dementia that would soon consume her, just as Alzheimer's had consumed Harold
That's a
Wilson
horrible
before her.
disease.
By the end, the dementia rendered her mute, almost incapable of doing even the simplest action. Margaret Thatcher passed away on April the 8th, 2013. While the world mourned the death of a great leader, the reaction in Britain itself, where towns devastated by her economic policies still haven't recovered, was more mixed. That week, the #2 record in the British chart was Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Yet, for all the bile many heaped upon her, for all the hatred she stirred up, Thatcher's legacy is all around us. It's from her Euroscepticism that the forces grew that would unleash Brexit, from her wave of deregulation that today's City of London was created. Almost every facet of modern life that we Brits take for granted, the depressed post-industrial towns, the special relationship with America, the lack of paralysing French-style strikes, all have their roots in Thatcherism. In the end, then, the good and the bad of her legacy are impossible to separate. She was who she was, with the blind faith to do both necessary things for Britain's future and to commit screw-ups that still haunt the nation to this day.
Wow. Well, I definitely see why she's a controversial figure.
Yeah.
No doubt.
That's an understatement from what I'm getting here. I mean, she is... It's like...
She's Marmite.
Marmite. You either love or hate her, right? It's almost like she's an enigma in a way. Like she had two complete sides, because it sounds like she did a lot that really benefited Britain, and then she did a lot that really hurt Britain.
Right. It was extreme on the
it was very extreme. She did, it sounds like, from what we learned here, it sounds like she just had a lot of policies that really benefited Britain even to this day, and a lot of policies that hurt Britain.
There wasn't really much middle ground there.
Yeah. And so obviously that makes sense why so many people would love and why so many people would hate her. I've known her name, even when I was a kid. Anybody, I knew of this person, Margaret Thatcher, didn't know why.
Yeah.
But that's why, because she was, it sounded like in a very intense, imagine being called the Iron Lady.
And think about, I think she lived up to her name.
She sounds like,
to a detriment maybe. But I think one of the reasons you probably know her name is because think about it, when you were growing up, you probably saw like news
bits
articles and like
her
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I probably just have pictures on my head when I was a youth of her or something. Wow. Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Like that is intense.
Yeah.
Wow. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Please click that like button. Feel free to drop your comments or suggestions about this video or others. And don't forget to subscribe to continue to follow us on our journey to discover anything and everything about the UK and Ireland. And also, guys, if you have any suggestions for other very influential figures in British history that you think we should look into in the near future, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks so much, guys. Until next time, peace.
Bye.